Hello and welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is the perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sukh Hayre, the founder of DME, and on this podcast we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts. This week, we speak with Jodie Beck of Hospice UK. Hospice UK are a national charity focused on improving access to end-of-life and palliative care services. We discuss the scope and rising demand of hospice treatment throughout the UK, the challenges around funding and staff shortages, and how they are emblematic of wider societal problems. We also dig deep into the assisted dying bill currently being debated in the UK Parliament and House of Lords, the needs this bill is attempting to fulfil, some of the misconceptions, and the grey areas raising many moral and philosophical questions. This was a really informative discussion around a sensitive subject matter, but one that needs to be addressed, so please enjoy Jodie Beck. Jodie Beck, welcome to the DME podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Really appreciate you giving up your time. Obviously, just to introduce our audience to you, you are the Public and Policy Affairs Manager for Hospice UK?
Yes. Yep. So I've been at Hospice UK for about a year. I kind of co-lead our activity across England. So my focus has mostly been on the assisted dying bill over the past year, which I'm sure we'll get into. But yeah, great to be on.
Thank you very much. So kind of an area of interest to me just from a personal perspective, but also I know it's been a hot topic of conversation for myself who kind of follows politics and public current affairs kind of loosely. And I know Hospice, I was looking for an expert, as you do, trying to kind of give me more information. I think our audience can benefit from that as well. But for those who aren't familiar, could you sort of explain the kind of the hospice, what Hospice UK do and the kind of services they offer for people in the UK?
Yeah, so Hospice UK, we are the membership organisation for hospices up and down the UK. We're the national champion for hospice care. And so our role is, whether it's through the research we do or, the programmes we run or the policy and public affairs work we do and the campaigning, it's to basically campaign for and call for hospice care for all, whether it's for now or in the future. And that kind of shapes all of our work. And that looks kind of different. We're UK wide, as the title suggests, and our work kind of looks a little bit different in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, depending on kind of the context there. So our membership are hospices that are delivering palliative and end of life care up and down the country.
Okay, that's really interesting. So, what are the main differences? Because I've only learned a little bit of this recently. But what are the differences between palliative and end-of-life care? How are those terms defined?
So palliative care, in a broad sense, it's an approach to care that really looks at how it can improve the quality of life of patients and their families that are navigating the kind of problems associated with having a life-threatening or a life-limiting illness. So palliative care can include a lot of different things. It's not just medical interventions, it's also emotional, social, or psychosocial interventions. So just to give you some examples, it can be things like pain and symptom management. It can be things like advanced care planning. So really discussing with people what's important to them in terms of the care that they receive, and also supporting people with life-threatening or life-limiting illness through like the emotions that they're experiencing. So fear, anger, grief, sadness, and that also extends to their families and caregivers and loved ones as well. So I think the key principle within palliative care is it's not just the one thing. It's about saying, what matters most to you and how can clinicians medically and emotionally support that right now. And then, so that's palliative care. End of life care is when that care is delivered when a person is approaching death. So kind of tailoring those interventions to kind of as much as is possible, improving the quality of life in a person's final few months or weeks or days. And I'm obviously from Hospice UK, so I'm sure we'll talk a lot about hospices specifically, but palliative and end-of-life care um, is delivered across a range of settings, whether it's in a hospice. Um, what a lot of people don't know is that the majority of hospice care is actually delivered in people's homes, where often it's not the case for everybody, but a lot of people want to be at home in their final moments. So that care is often delivered in people's homes, also in a range of settings, hospitals, care homes, etc.
So do you guys work closely with the NHS and local authorities, or is your service independent of that?
So there are a small number of NHS hospices, but the vast majority of hospices are independent charities. So, but the NHS and local authorities are really crucial to hospices because um, hospices get about 40% of their funding from the NHS in England. And I should say I'll speak about England in this context because it's a little bit different in the devolved nations. But yeah, they're independent charities. So, and this kind of touches on our key campaign at Hospice UK, which is around fair funding for hospices. What we see often is that most hospices rely really heavily on charitable donations to deliver care that the NHS have to provide, which we think is a huge problem. We think that the NHS, so local commissioners should give more funding to hospices. So hospices can kind of fund the kind of specialist care that they provide in a more consistent and reliable way. But we know that balance isn't right at the moment. So too often because there's been a shortage of government funding in recent years, hospices often are supplementing their budgets from like the donations of local people, whether they're running marathons or doing bake sales. And whilst it's really important, whilst that, those donations from local people are really important, and it means that hospices have a really important and wonderful connection with their local communities, and it means that they can design services that are really tailored to what that community needs. Our argument is that government should be providing the amount of funding needed, so there's like consistency in specialist services across the board. And at the moment, that's not happening in the way it should be. So the context for hospice care at the moment is really they're kind of facing a funding cliff edge, with lots of hospices either having made cuts to services already or are having to think about doing so in the near future because of that funding issue.
So is this problem of this funding gap, or the gap in services, is that exacerbated over the last decade, 2 decades? I'm not sure of the historical context. Is there, I know the population is aging, we kind of hear that all the time, and people are living longer and healthier until the obviously final days. Is that an exponentially increasing problem in terms of the funding gap and the ability to deliver care?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. And you're absolutely right with an aging population. So the challenges that hospices face are increasing as more people are living for longer. They're living with more complex conditions. More people are needing palliative and end-of-life care. But I would especially look at since the pandemic. Oh, sorry, the cleaners are in the office. Sorry, I'll start again. Especially since the pandemic, what we've seen is, whether it's the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, all of the problems that you and me will face in terms of paying our bills and the cost of everything that we need. If you think about running a service, that is just kind of scaled up tenfold or whatever. And so the cost of running a hospice, of delivering that vital care, not only do more people need it, but it's costing more money at a time when the funding received from government is kind of, there's a real shortage of it. So that problem has really been exacerbated over recent years. And especially as well, so another thing that hospices often have to contend with is because they're delivering care on behalf of the NHS, but they're independent of the NHS. So when you see on the news that the health secretary has agreed a pay increase for NHS workers, hospices actually don't get the money to give those pay rises to their staff. They have to find the money within their existing budgets. And so that's just another cost that hospices have to keep up with in order to be kind of competitive, I guess, in terms of, drawing in that workforce into the hospice. So it's kind of a culmination of so many different challenges alongside that rising demand.
That's exactly my next question. Obviously, we've got a rising demand for those services, but is it on the supply side? Is it getting more challenging to actually just offer those services, whether it's wage demands, whether it's having the available workforce to fulfill those roles and meet those demand needs?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Workforce shortages are a real issue. We're already working from a context where like 1 in 4 people who need palliative care don't get it. And we've got kind of the workforce within palliative and end-of-life care. I don't have them to hand at the moment, but there are some really like interesting but really worrying stats around what will happen in the next decade or so when a lot of the profession will actually be retiring. And so, we need to think much earlier on in the process of, are we training enough palliative care doctors? What are the routes for people to become nurses and to stay in the profession and to progress? But also, what are the incentives for people to go and work at a hospice? And that kind of ties to what I was just saying around the kind of pay rises, is that all of those things, like having the right funding formula, is really important for hospices to retain and get in kind of new staff as well. So all of these things kind of form a patchwork of real, I guess, precarity for the sector at the moment. I think we're at almost at a bit of a crossroads in terms of funding for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be one of the symptoms, one of the downstream impacted services within the UK. You've got kind of economic challenges. My own biases are kind of towards kind of free markets and looking at economic solutions to problems that exist. I think these are downstream from economic problems that we've got, and obviously the economy at the moment hasn't been great. I'd argue since COVID or even before that, it's the problems have only exacerbated, and we haven't kind of, as a society, kind of bitten the bullet and kind of been honest with ourselves in terms of what we're promising to deliver versus what we can deliver. And I think my own kind of experiences over the last few months and couple of years in terms of on this end of the on the NHS or kind of the social care skills or social services that are being offered, there is a massive gap between what the demand is, what the ability to deliver those services are, and what the expectations are. And you kind of see, if you're on the shop front end of it, if you like, there is a massive gap between what's needed and what can be reasonably offered. So how, obviously Hospice UK is a charitable organisation, how do you influence public policy to kind of make politicians or the decision makers aware of those gaps and kind of lobby and petition for changes and for improvements?
So we use a range of tactics and methods to get our message out there and in front of the decision makers, right? And so back in October, we launched our Fair Funding campaign, and that campaign really kind of, I suppose we've been talking about funding and the funding crisis for hospices for a really long time, but I think the Fair Funding campaign, we really broke that down into what does that actually mean in practice? What do we need from government to make that a reality? And so we launched our 4-point plan, which I'll run through really quickly. It touches on some of what we've already spoke about. The first is to make sure that all of the specialist palliative care that hospices provide is fully funded by local NHS commissioners. So that's making sure that there's enough funding from government going to local NHS commissioners so they can commission the levels of care needed for their population and ensuring that's fully funded. The second is around making sure that hospices have proper contracts with those local integrated care boards. Because so often what we see is that one of our members in one part of the country will have a really good relationship with their local NHS commissioners. They'll have a proper contract that reflects the rising costs and how much it actually costs to deliver that care in a hospice. Whereas we might have another member in another part of the country that has a really tricky relationship with that ICB and might have a grant agreement that is about 10 years old and doesn't reflect the cost of the services. The third in the 4-point plan is around making sure that, like I was saying earlier, when the government agree pay rises for NHS staff, that hospices actually get the funding needed to give their staff those pay rises. And then the fourth is around tackling inequity, making sure that there's accountability for the equitable provision of that care. So making sure that the government hold ICBs accountable for how much care they're commissioning and making sure that reflects what the local population needs. And so we launched that in Parliament. We did this really creative action. We actually, because the government have recently published this 10-year health plan, which is all about shifting care away from hospital and into the community. It's a real focus on prevention, which hospices are really fantastic at. Like I said, most hospice care is delivered in people's homes. We recreated a hospice at home setup in Parliament. So MPs could come down and actually get a glimpse of what it might look like to receive hospice care at home. And actually, as you were kind of saying, in terms of your own personal experience, it's a really common experience to support a loved one or a family member in their final moments. And I think the action really struck a chord with a lot of MPs who might have had that experience as well. We had over 170 MPs come to our event from across all parties, including the Care Minister, Stephen Kinnock. And so I guess that's one example of what we do to get our message out there. We kind of saw so many MPs on that day, and that's led to kind of engagement afterwards where they want to work with us more closely, want to understand hospice care a bit more and take actions themselves to make the case for fair funding. But it's also about having those, maintaining those really important and constructive relationships with civil servants as well, who are in the detail of looking at different issues. So they're looking at, we recognise there's the hospice sector are facing difficulty, and really thinking about what we as Hospice UK can do to make sure that they understand the needs of the sector. And thirdly and finally, we also use the media to get our message out there as well. So when we've got new stats or perhaps one of our members are making a cut to their services, we work really hard to make sure that we are supporting our individual members to get their messages out there as well, and that can be a really effective vehicle of getting decision makers to listen.
Well, that was my kind of next question that just flowed on from there. Is obviously, firstly, kind of how much engagement did you get from MPs and kind of members of Parliament and their civil service and their staff in terms of what you're trying to do, but also probably kind of on your own background and skills as a communication czar person. How hard is it? Because obviously there's lots of charities and lots of interested bodies are always trying to push their own agendas and causes for however they're received. It must be very difficult to kind of break through and make sure your voice is heard or given equal playtime amongst all the other noble causes, because everyone thinks that their issues are probably the most important, right?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and it is challenging because there are so many important causes out there. People have very finite attention spans, and the political context, as we've seen in the news this week, is ever changing. So it's about knowing what your message is. So I think that's been really key for us actually in being really clear about what we mean when we say fair funding. So being really clear about the message and being repetitive, basically. I think knowing what your moment is. So I think for us, and I'm sure we'll get onto the bill, but actually it's been really important to be speaking about hospice care and our campaign for fair funding alongside the assisted dying bill process, because a lot of people, because of the assisted dying bill, a lot of people are, an increased number of people are thinking about death and dying, actually. And whilst we have a neutral position on assisted dying, it's been really important to say, actually, regardless of what happens with the bill, we need to make sure that everybody who needs palliative and end-of-life care get it. And so using key political moments, and I think an upcoming one for us is we're coming to the end of the financial year. Hospices will be entering a new financial year with no new funding and in a really challenging context. So thinking about how can we mark that moment is a really important one to get our message out there. So knowing your message, knowing your moment, and also sometimes not being afraid to experiment with new tactics. Getting a hospital bed in Parliament, for example, was incredibly challenging, and I never thought I'd do it in my career, but actually thinking a bit outside of the box really lasts. It has a lasting impact on MPs, and doing something a bit different is always worth a go.
Yeah, I think it's kind of maybe the art of communication, isn't it? You've got to stand out from the crowd in one way, shape, or form, and it's better to be noticed for doing something wild and imaginative than not to be noticed at all. Okay, so as you kind of said, we touched on it a little bit, but the assisted dying bill, which seems to be working its way through Parliament and through the House of Lords, and I've kind of seen various kind of snippets on social media and lots of back and forth in terms of what it is, and lots of conversations about whether the bill's fit for purpose and what it's not. Can you just kind of briefly describe what the bill is and what it's trying to achieve, please?
Yeah, so the bill, its official title is the Terminally Ill Adults End of Life Bill. And I guess what its objective is on paper, what it says is that the bill, if it passes, will allow adults who meet the eligibility criteria to request and be given permission to end their own lives. It would legalise assisted dying in England and Wales. And there's also a bill going through in Scotland as well. But in terms of the bill in England and Wales, the eligibility to kind of go through that process is you've got to be 18 or above. You've got to have the mental capacity to make an informed decision, and you have to have a terminal illness with a prognosis of less than 6 months. And it's important to say as well that this is a private member's bill, so it's not. It's a conscience issue. So none of the main political parties, other than the Green Party, who had a commitment to work towards assisted dying in their manifesto, the other parties, so the Labour Party, the Labour government, don't have a position on this. They're neutral. And so it's up to individual MPs to make a call on whether they want to vote it through or not, and same for peers. And it also means that it hasn't been given any government time. So it's kind of going through a slightly different process than one we would see if the government put it forward, which has meant that it's encountered some challenges it otherwise wouldn't have, although I imagine it still would have been really challenging if it was a government bill. But yeah. So
that essentially means that obviously the Labour majority of 300 odd at the moment, if they did support it, then there will be their MPs to say you're voting for this one. It would make it a lot easier to sail its way through the legislative process. So how does that differ from what the options are for assisted dying at the moment without this law in place? What options does an adult with a terminal illness have today in terms of if they wanted to go that route of assisted suicide? I mean, assisted death. Who would be liable? Because obviously, if you commit suicide yourself or take your own life in any way, shape, or form, obviously you're not going to be feeling culpable. Is the law there to protect kind of caregivers or doctors or medical professionals? Or
I mean, I think so. A lot of the people. So firstly, I just want to say as well that Hospice UK are neutral on the bill. So we don't see it as our role to either support or oppose a change in the law on assisted dying. But we have been engaging with this process in a lot of detail because we want to make sure that the experience and expertise of hospices informs the political process. but in terms of I guess the what the Act will do, as well as introduce this new process, it will also decriminalise. It will change the criminal law around suicide and assisting suicide, because it's attached to the Suicide Act, which is like the technicality around this. At the moment, assisted dying isn't legal in the UK. So some of the campaigners that are campaigning for this bill will often kind of reference how some people will actually go to another country to access an assisted death. So Switzerland and Dignitas is the one that is commonly referred to. So yeah, that's kind of the state of play at the moment. So it would change the criminal law and decriminalise kind of assisting suicide. But there are, I guess, one of the points of debate throughout this whole political process is this law safe? Is the bill safe? Does it have enough safeguards to protect people from coercion? And you know, what are the steps in the process that would kind of assess whether people have been coerced or not? Yeah.
So I mean, just to kind of speak on that, my own personal biases are quite skeptical of big government, and if I'm just looking at this from a logical perspective, we're trying, well, we've got too many old people. It's too costly to keep them in care and deliver care to them for an elongated period of time. Because obviously, people are living longer, and medical medicines are a lot better, etc. And just from kind of reading maybe headlines rather than digging into it too deeply, I know Canada has had a version of the assisted dying bill for maybe the last couple of years. You kind of hear some horror stories of what's being offered to people in vulnerable positions. And although I can see the humane side of it, and obviously trying to deliver that end of life care and probably trying to relieve people from an inevitable situation, there is the other side of it, which is it being inappropriately offered to people for completely the wrong reason, just because it's if people are managing a spreadsheet, it makes the spreadsheet look a little bit healthier if they don't have the same liabilities, if you want to put it so crudely, in terms of cost overruns and all that kind of thing. How did it? Is that a hard balance to strike, and especially to legislate? Because obviously we're talking with human beings here, and everyone's circumstances are different, and what might seem terminal one minute may not be the next, whether you kind of believe in miracles or not. But you do get these cases, don't you, of people who've been kind of given end-of-life care or given hours or weeks to live, and 2 years later they've fully recovered and they're living perfectly healthy, normal lives. So it is a difficult one, isn't it?
I mean, it's such a complex piece of legislation, and I mean, you're seeing that now, right? That it's in the House of Lords, and you know, the Lords and I mean, we saw it in the Commons as well, but there are so many aspects to this legislation that can be pulled apart, and you know, there's so much grey in the middle, whereas a piece of legislation in lots of ways is quite concrete and final, because it's really hard to change something once it's passed into law. And so I think, and you know, it's bound up in, it is a conscience issue, so it's bound up in not only what somebody might say their professional judgment is, or you know, from their professional background and expertise, it's also bound up in emotion and, you know, our sense of what is right and wrong, and that differs. I think for us it's been really important to highlight within our kind of neutral position that the progression of this bill is taking place against the backdrop of real inequality in palliative and end-of-life care. As I've said already, you know, access to that care at end of life is really patchy and unfair, and often it's based on who you are and where you live. That those are often the determinants of whether you get the care you need. And what we've highlighted throughout is that strengthening and properly funding palliative and end-of-life care has to happen in its own right, regardless of whether the bill passes. But it's also a vital safeguard to ensure that no one feels driven to seek an assisted death because that care that they really need is not available. And it is a real worry for us that, you know, we are almost every week we hear of one of our members having to cut staff and services, and that does have a real knock-on impact. And so we've been juggling that bigger picture alongside looking at some of the issues specifically within the bill, and the challenges that might present for the hospice sector. One of the things that we've highlighted throughout is that it's some of the bill, it's really unclear in some parts of the bill what would be required of the hospice sector. How much money would they need to actually fulfill the responsibilities of this? And also, what we've been really clear on is that hospices should be able to make their own mind up around how they might be involved. Our members are in very different kind of places on that, and they need to have the flexibility to determine the extent of their own involvement. But yeah, our top priority is making sure that palliative care is fixed and available to everyone that needs it.
Yeah, so I think it is a deep and kind of, like you said, it is a massive grey area and it's very complex. So I'm not sure I've got the mental capacity to kind of get around all those issues. But just in closing, if our audience wanted to support Hospice UK and kind of get involved with what you guys do, or maybe support you in any other ways, what's the best place for them to do that?
So visit our website, hospiceuk.org. You'll also find on there a hospice care finder. So whether you're looking for care for someone you love, or if you're just interested in where your local hospice is and how you might be able to support locally, you'll be able to find where your local one is by looking at our hospice care finder. But on our website, you'll find all of that and more details on the work that we're doing. So yeah, please have a look.
Yeah, awesome. We'll obviously promote that on the podcast description and in the social media posts that we do for this podcast. But Jodie Beck, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.